Now that Atari had actual competition in the console race with the Intellivision moving onto the scene, it was time for yet another company to make its move. Coleco released the ColecoVision in August of 1982, more than 2 years after the Intellivision debuted and 5 since the Atari 2600 came out. The design drew inspiration from the Intellivision, and it sought to be a vast improvement to its obsolete predecessor, the Coleco Telstar Arcade. The consumers, however, were going to be hard to impress. They were mostly consumed with the Atari 2600 and Intellivision systems, and were set in their ways, so to speak. Coleco, though, had a strategy that would put them on the map. They got the exclusive rights to publish Nintendo's Donkey Kong game. As a result, a very good port of the game was released by Coleco for their system as a pack-in title, and terrible inferior versions were made by Coleco for the Atari 2600 and Intellivision. The system thrived due to its incredibly accurate arcade ports. The system confused consumers, however, as many thought it was a successor to the Intellivision due to its name, which was not the case. Out of the gate, the ColecoVision enjoyed success through the 1982 holiday season, moving more than 500,000 units at a price tag of $175. They certainly weren't the king of home consoles after this, but it outsold both the Atari 2600 and Intellivision through the holiday season. Atari knew its 2600 system was outdated, so in late 1981 they began work on its successor, which would later be known as the Atari 5200. The system was built to compete with the Intellivision and the new ColecoVision system, and in terms of a follow-up to the 2600, the system actually turned out to be a flop. There are several reasons as to why it failed, but I can summarize it in 2 statements. The system had no backwards compatibility with the Atari 2600, and it had an awful controller. Yes, it is now known that these controllers were notable for being fragile and breaking after just a few hours of hardcore play. Though it was graphically more capable than the Intellivision, it barely sold 1 million units in its entire lifetime, which was an extremely disappointing performance that Atari didn't see coming. The Atari 5200's library of software mostly consisted of rehashed or enhanced Atari 2600 titles, therefore consumers weren't really interested in picking it up, especially since the ColecoVision, which came out a month before it, was a better system in every way. In 1982, home console gaming was outshined by a glut of top-tier arcade titles, the first of which that I'd like to discuss is Qbert. This game was conceptualized by the pair of Warren Davis and Jeff Lee. Jeff Lee designed the Qbert character as a small orange ball with a large snout to shoot projectiles with. Originally, they were developing a game that would have the character shooting things out of his nose, but the idea was dropped. Though in the final product, they keep Qbert's nose intact. The arcade cabinet is very colorful and vibrant, and I can tell that in an arcade setting, it would really stick out and make you want to play it. The game is an isometric platformer. The goal of the game is to make Qbert jump on every cube in the pyramid to change its color, all while avoiding enemies. If you can change the color of every cube, it is on to the next stage. Since the game was an isometric view, players would have to move the joystick in diagonal angles in order to make Qbert jump in the correct directions, which was unique at the time, knowing that there weren't really many 3D games like this. There are floating discs you can hop on to avoid danger too, but if you get hit, Qbert curses like a drunken sailor, which sort of gives this game a more comedic feel. Qbert was received well and is now considered to be an arcade classic with the likes of Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong. He isn't a huge icon, but he does have his place in history. The 2012 film Wreck-It Ralph featured Qbert and helped bring the character in the game back into the minds of many fans and people alike. Qbert was ported to almost every video game system imaginable, which isn't really surprising when you look at it. Yet again, Namco struck gold with another huge arcade hit called Dig Dug. It was released in April of 1982 in Japan and in the United States a few weeks later under the Atari label. Dig Dug was built off of Namco's Galaga engine, similar to the way Donkey Kong was built off of the Radar Scope game. Dig Dug is simple in its gameplay. You control a miner who goes underground to try and destroy monster enemies. There are two types of enemies in Dig Dug: Pukas and Flygars, who shoot fire. You get rid of these enemies by either dropping rocks on them, or the more common way of pumping them up full of air until they pop. Popping the enemies is extremely satisfying. Enemies can also float through the ground to get to you, so beware. When you've popped all the enemies, you've beaten the stage. Dig Dug features a very simplistic musical track that plays while you move your character. This is the first of Namco's arcade games to feature background music. I have to say, for this game's sake, it is very welcomed. All of the music in this game was composed by Yuriko Kano. Dig Dug is yet another great game from the great minds at Namco. Yes, I know I've mentioned Namco a lot here, but 1982 was just a big year for them. They released yet another great arcade game called Pole Position. Toru Iwatani, who had designed Pac-Man, also designed this game. The game was released in two variants, an upright cabinet and a cockpit cabinet. Pole Position is cited as the most important racing video game ever made, as it did indeed set the formula for racing games for the future. The game also featured product placements on the billboards in the background, which for better or for worse is still a strategy used today in video games. In this game, you control a Formula 1 race car. You must qualify before you can compete against the other racers, which too was a foreign concept to gamers. You had to qualify to play the actual game? How strange. The game features 3D graphics as well as real-life Formula 1 racetracks. Along with digitized voices, it was probably the most realistic video game at the time too. Although it was developed as a simulator initially, it went on to become a full-fledged arcade game. Even now, if you play a racing game, chances are it has some semblance of Pole Position. The final arcade game of 1982 I'd like to cover is one that you probably have never heard of: Joust. It was developed by Williams Electronics. It was designed by John Newcomer and programmed by Bill Futzenreuter. The game was built to be a cooperative two-player game, but the team who developed it wanted to set it apart from the two-player space games, which were immensely popular in the time. In the game, the player controls a knight who is riding a flying ostrich. The goal of the game is to eliminate the enemy knights riding buzzards. In this game, they are referred to as waves of enemies. To defeat the other knights, you must collide with them. Your relative position in comparison to the way the enemy is when you collide will determine the result. Though Joust might not be in the league of Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, it's a pivotal game for both the cooperative and fantasy game genre. The ColecoVision showed the world just how impressive the home video game machine could be, and the Atari 5200 showed just how little players cared about moving on to the next generation. In fact, the Atari 5200 was scrapped in favor of the 2600 because more people bought it. Qbert was a marvelous game with a unique concept and nice isometric 3D look to it. Namco's Dig Dug and Pole Position showed that Namco was the king of the arcade, and finally, the underrated Joust by Williams Electronics paved the way for a new genre of video games.